Remove him. Now. The order cracked across the hotel lobby like a glass dropped onto marble. Heads turned. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Even the soft piano music drifting from hidden speakers suddenly felt distant. Richard Coleman stood behind the front desk with his shoulders squared and his jaw tight, pointing toward a tall black man standing quietly near the center of the lobby. The man wore dark jeans, clean sneakers, and a simple charcoal polo. Nothing about him looked flashy. Nothing announced wealth. Nothing suggested power. And that was exactly why Richard had already made up his mind. Two security officers exchanged a glance before taking a cautious step forward. The lobby of the Grand Meridian Hotel was known for attracting executives, celebrities, and investors. Crystal chandeliers reflected warm light across polished stone floors. A fountain hummed softly beneath a 30-foot ceiling. It was the kind of place where appearances carried weight. The kind of place where people were judged before they ever spoke. The man at the center of the attention remained calm. His name was Darius Bennett. He neither stepped back nor raised his voice. He simply looked at Richard with a level expression that somehow made the manager more uncomfortable. Richard mistook that calm for weakness. "Sir, I'm asking you one last time," Richard said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. "You need to leave the property immediately." A murmur swept through the crowd. A couple standing near the elevators slowed their pace. A businessman lowered his phone. A woman carrying a designer handbag paused beside a column and watched. Darius folded his hands in front of him. "And why exactly would I do that?" he asked. The question wasn't aggressive. It wasn't emotional. If anything, it sounded genuinely curious. Richard hated that. He preferred arguments. Arguments gave him control. Calm people forced him to explain himself. "Because this hotel is hosting a private executive event today," Richard replied. "And you are not authorized to be here." Darius nodded once, as if filing away every word. The air in the lobby wasn't quiet anymore. It was waiting to see who would blink first. Richard leaned forward. Security. The officers moved another step closer. Several guests exchanged uncomfortable looks. One young front desk employee named Emily Carter stared at Darius for a second longer than everyone else. Something about him felt familiar. She couldn't explain why. She only knew that the confidence in his eyes didn't match the situation unfolding around him. Most people being publicly challenged would look embarrassed, angry, nervous. Darius looked none of those things. He looked like a man watching a clock count down. Richard noticed Emily staring and shot her a warning glance. She immediately looked away. The manager then straightened his tie and folded his arms, convinced he had already won. What he didn't know was that somewhere above the lobby, in a private conference room prepared for an announcement that would change the future of the entire hotel chain, a presentation was waiting to begin. And on the first slide of that presentation was a photograph of the very man Richard was trying to remove. 15 minutes earlier, the lobby had felt completely different. The morning sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, painting long bands of gold across the marble floor. Guests rolled luggage toward the elevators. Business travelers checked messages on their phones. Staff members moved with practiced smiles. Everything looked polished. Everything looked perfect. Darius Bennett stepped through the revolving doors alone. No assistant. No security detail. No luxury car waiting outside. Just a man carrying a slim leather portfolio and a quiet purpose. Most people would have assumed he was another guest arriving for a meeting. That assumption was exactly what he expected. Earlier that morning, a transaction worth hundreds of millions of dollars had officially closed. Months of negotiations, legal reviews, and board meetings had ended with a signature. By noon, Darius would become the public face of the new ownership group, taking control of the Grand Meridian and dozens of other properties across the country. The official announcement was scheduled for later that day. Very few employees knew who he was. Even fewer had seen his face. That was intentional. Darius believed numbers could tell part of a story. Reports could reveal another part. But culture could only be understood in person. You had to walk through the front door. You had to watch people when they thought nobody important was watching. As he crossed the lobby, he noticed small details. A bellman helping an elderly guest with extra patience. A housekeeper stopping to give directions to a confused visitor. A concierge greeting a family with genuine warmth. Those moments mattered. They revealed character. They revealed standards. Then he noticed the front desk. Richard Coleman stood behind it speaking with two supervisors. Even from across the lobby, Darius could sense the difference. The manager smiled when certain guests approached. The smile disappeared when others did. It was subtle. Most people would have missed it. Darius did not. He had spent 20 years building companies by studying people. Patterns always revealed themselves eventually. He walked toward a seating area near the center of the lobby and took a seat. The large conference room on the mezzanine level was being prepared for the ownership announcement. Staff members occasionally moved in and out carrying presentation materials. Darius glanced at his watch. 43 minutes remained until the event. Plenty of time to observe. His phone vibrated once. A message appeared from Sophia Brooks. Everything is ready. Board members have arrived. Media team is standing by. Darius typed a short response. Excellent. Proceed as planned. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and looked around the lobby again. A young employee at the front desk caught his attention. Emily Carter. She was reviewing guest information while occasionally glancing toward the conference level. Unlike most of the staff, she appeared focused on details rather than appearances. Darius appreciated that. A few moments later, Richard noticed him sitting alone. The manager studied him for several seconds. His expression changed. Not dramatically, just enough. Darius had seen that look before. It was the look people wore when they thought they already knew someone's story before hearing a single word. And as Richard began walking across the lobby toward him, Darius had a feeling the real test of the hotel was about to begin. Richard stopped a few feet from Darius and offered a smile that never reached his eyes. Good morning, he said. Are you a guest with the executive event? Darius looked up calmly. I am here for a meeting. It was a truthful answer. Richard nodded slowly, but something in his expression hardened. Which company? He asked. The ownership group, Darius replied. Richard let out a short laugh. Not loud, just enough for nearby employees to hear. That is a very private meeting. Darius remained seated. I am aware. The manager glanced at the simple polo shirt, the jeans, the absence of a visible conference badge. Every assumption he wanted to make seemed to arrive at once. Do you have credentials? Richard asked. Darius folded his hands. Not yet. That answer landed exactly the way Richard expected. His confidence grew. A supervisor standing nearby smirked. A guest checking email looked up briefly before returning to his screen. Richard straightened his tie. Sir, this event is restricted to invited executives, investors, and ownership representatives. Darius nodded. Understood. The calm response irritated him. Most people explained themselves. Most people became defensive. Darius did neither. It felt less like a conversation and more like a mirror reflecting Richard's own behavior back at him. Then perhaps you should wait elsewhere, Richard said. The lobby is reserved for registered guests and conference attendees. Darius glanced around the room. Families were walking through. Travelers were checking in. Tourists were taking photos near the fountain. It appears open to everyone, he replied. The supervisor beside Richard chuckled under his breath. Richard did not. Sir, I am trying to be polite. Darius looked directly at him. So am I. The temperature of the conversation changed. Not visibly. Not dramatically, but enough. Emily watched from the front desk. She could feel it. The tension was no longer about hotel policy. It was becoming personal. Richard took another look at Darius, searching for something that justified his suspicion. He found nothing except confidence, and somehow that bothered him more. Can I see identification? He asked. Darius reached into his pocket and handed over a driver's license. Richard glanced at it for only a second before handing it back. He barely seemed interested in the information. The decision had already been made. Nearby, 2 security officers had quietly moved closer after receiving a message from a supervisor. Their presence alone changed the atmosphere. Guests began noticing. Conversation slowed. Emily felt a knot forming in her stomach. Something about this was wrong. Then Richard crossed a line he did not realize he was crossing. We have had situations before, he said carefully. People claiming access to events they were never invited to. Darius tilted his head slightly. And what exactly made you think that applies to me? For the first time, Richard had no immediate answer. The silence stretched for a moment. Then he gestured toward the security officers. I think it would be best if we verified a few things. The lobby no longer felt welcoming. It felt charged, like a storm gathering behind clear skies. And while Richard believed he was protecting the hotel, he had no idea he was creating the very moment that would soon change his career forever. Emily Carter tried to focus on the screen in front of her, but her attention kept drifting back to the man sitting calmly in the lobby. The more she watched him, the more familiar he seemed. She had seen hundreds of faces during her 2 years at the Grand Meridian. Most blurred together after a while. This one did not. There was something about him. Something she could not place. Richard continued speaking with security while nearby guests watched from a distance. The atmosphere had changed. It no longer felt like a routine conversation. It felt like a mistake slowly taking shape. Emily glanced down at her workstation and opened the internal event schedule. The ownership announcement occupied nearly the entire afternoon calendar. Access was restricted, but staff could still see limited details. She scrolled through preparation notes, conference room assignments, and arrival schedules. Then she froze. A name caught her eye. Darius Bennett. Her eyes widened slightly. She read it again. Then a third time. Darius Bennett. The same name. The same man. A confidential notation appeared beside it. Executive arrival. Ownership group. Emily looked up immediately. Across the lobby, Darius remained composed while Richard questioned him as if he were an inconvenience. Her stomach tightened. There had to be some explanation. Maybe it was another Darius Bennett. Maybe she was misunderstanding the document. She clicked deeper into the schedule and found an attached photograph prepared for event coordination. The image loaded slowly. When it appeared, Emily felt her pulse jump. It was him. The exact same man sitting near the fountain. She stared at the screen for several seconds. The room suddenly felt smaller. Richard had no idea. Neither did security. Neither did anyone watching. Emily looked around carefully. The information was clearly marked confidential. Staff had been instructed not to discuss ownership changes until the official announcement. But what she was witnessing did not feel right. She stood from her station and took a cautious step toward Richard. "Mr. Coleman," she said quietly. He barely looked at her. "Not now, Emily." She hesitated. "I think there may be something you should verify first." Richard sighed heavily. The reaction alone told her he was already annoyed. "I said not now." Emily lowered her voice even further. "I believe he may be connected to the executive meeting upstairs." Richard finally turned toward her. The look he gave her was sharp enough to stop most employees from speaking further. "Emily, return to your desk." She glanced toward Darius. He remained silent, watching, waiting. Not once had he raised his voice. Not once had he demanded special treatment. Somehow that made the situation worse. Richard interpreted calm as weakness. Emily was beginning to recognize it as confidence. Around the lobby, guests continued observing. A businessman standing near the elevators shook his head slightly. An older woman sitting beside the fireplace looked increasingly uncomfortable. Even one of the security officers appeared. Uncertain. The story Richard believed he was telling no longer matched what people were seeing. Emily returned to her station, but she could not stop thinking about the photograph on her screen. Above the lobby, workers were making final adjustments inside the conference room. Presentation slides were being tested. Microphones were being checked. A countdown clock displayed 31 minutes until the announcement. And while most people in the hotel believed the important guest had not arrived yet, the truth was sitting quietly in the lobby watching every decision unfold in real time. The countdown clock above the conference room dropped to 26 minutes. Darius noticed it without looking directly at it. Years of boardrooms, negotiations, and acquisitions had trained him to track details the way other people track conversations. Across the lobby, Richard was still speaking with security. The manager's confidence had grown with every passing minute. That was the danger of assumptions. The longer they survived unchallenged, the more they felt like facts. One of the security officers stepped closer and offered a professional smile. "Sir, perhaps we can relocate this conversation to another area." Darius looked up. The officer's tone remained respectful, but the message underneath was clear. "Leave. Move. Disappear quietly." Darius nodded once. "I am comfortable right here." The officer hesitated. He seemed less certain than before. Guests were watching now. Employees were watching. The entire lobby felt suspended between two different versions of reality. Richard still believed he was dealing with someone who did not belong. Everyone else was beginning to wonder if the opposite was true. Darius sat back and allowed the silence to settle. Then a memory surfaced. Not because he invited it. Because moments like this always opened the same door. 17 years earlier, he had walked into a hotel in Dallas wearing the only suit he owned. He was 25 years old. Fresh out of graduate school. Ambitious. Exhausted. determined. He had arrived for an investment conference that cost nearly half his savings to attend. The clerk behind the desk looked at him, looked at the reservation, then looked at him again. The room suddenly became unavailable. The explanation changed 3 times in 5 minutes. First it was a booking error. Then it was a payment issue. Then it was a policy problem. None of it was true. He remembered sitting in his car that night staring at the hotel lights across the parking lot. He remembered the feeling more than the details. Not anger. Not embarrassment. Something colder. The realization that some people saw his appearance before they saw anything else. That memory never completely disappeared. It became fuel instead. Every acquisition, every partnership, every late night at the office, every risk, every success. But success did not erase moments like this. It simply changed the setting. Back in the present, Richard approached again. "I think we have been patient enough," he said. The words carried a sharp edge now. Darius studied him calmly. "Have you?" Richard frowned. Nearby, Emily watched from her desk, her heart racing. She had already seen the executive file. She already knew the truth. Yet every second that passed made speaking up feel more dangerous. The manager glanced around the lobby and noticed the growing audience. He interpreted their attention as support. In reality, it was concern. The room was no longer following his version of events. It was questioning it. Above them, technicians completed final tests inside the conference room. Presentation screens glowed blue. Microphones came alive. Staff members took their seats. 25 minutes remained until the announcement. And while Richard believed he was approaching the end of an inconvenience, he was actually approaching the moment his entire understanding of the situation would collapse. 21 minutes remained. The number glowed quietly on a monitor outside the conference room, while the lobby below drifted closer to a breaking point. Darius glanced at his phone. One new message waited. Sophia Brooks. Final preparations complete. Media partners seated. Board members present. Awaiting your arrival. Darius read it once and locked the screen. Across the lobby, Richard interpreted the silence as surrender. He could not have been more wrong. Some people raised their voices when challenged. Darius raised standards. That difference had built an empire. Richard folded his arms. "I am giving you one final opportunity to cooperate." Darius looked at him. Cooperate with what? The question landed harder than Richard expected. For a moment, he had no answer. The manager recovered quickly. "With hotel policy." Darius nodded slowly. "Then perhaps you should explain which policy I have violated." A few nearby guests exchanged glances. The question was reasonable. The answer never came. Richard shifted topics instead. He spoke about security procedures, private events, restricted access, general concerns. Everything except a specific rule. Emily noticed it immediately. So did several people listening nearby. The story was beginning to unravel under its own weight. One of the security officers cleared his throat. "Sir, has this guest caused a disturbance?" Richard looked annoyed by the question. "That is not the point." The officer waited. "It is part of the point." Richard's jaw tightened. Darius said nothing. He simply watched. The lobby felt different now. Earlier, people had assumed Richard was protecting the hotel. Now many were wondering whether he was protecting his own pride. Emily looked down at her workstation again. The confidential executive file remained open. Darius Bennett, ownership group representative, primary speaker. She felt her pulse quicken. Every instinct told her to say something. Every year she had worked under Richard told her not to. Then her screen refreshed automatically. A new internal message appeared. Conference announcement begins in 20 minutes. All department managers report immediately after conclusion. She stared at it. 20 minutes. That was all that remained. Meanwhile, Darius unlocked his phone and made a call. He spoke quietly enough that only a few words carried across the lobby. "Sophia." A brief pause. "Activate transition protocol." Richard laughed. Actually laughed. "Transition protocol," he repeated. "What is that supposed to mean?" Darius slipped the phone back into his pocket. "You will find out soon enough." The answer bothered Richard more than any argument could have. The manager wanted resistance. He wanted emotion. He wanted a reason to feel justified. Instead, he was facing certainty. Above them, conference staff began welcoming board members into their seats. Presentation screens lit up one by one. Company logos appeared. Audio systems came online. The event was no longer approaching. It was arriving. Back in the lobby, a businessman near the elevators quietly asked another guest, Does that man seem worried to you? The other guest looked toward Darius and shook his head. Not even a little. Richard heard neither comment. If he had, he might have paid closer attention. He might have noticed that the only person in the room acting like time was on his side was the man everyone else was questioning. 19 minutes remained. The countdown continued. The hotel was preparing to meet its future, and that future was sitting calmly in the lobby while the past argued with him. 17 minutes remained. The conference room upstairs was full. Board members sat in reserved seats. Investors reviewed briefing packets. Media representatives adjusted cameras and tested microphones. Throughout the hotel, employees prepared for an announcement that would reshape the company. In the lobby, nobody realized the announcement had already arrived. A soft chime echoed from overhead speakers. Several television screens mounted near the elevators flickered to life. Guests barely noticed at first. The screens normally displayed hotel promotions, weather updates, and local attractions. This time was different. A company logo filled every display. Staff members paused. Conversations slowed. Richard glanced upward for only a second before returning his attention to Darius. "This changes nothing," he said. "You still need to leave." Darius looked at the nearest screen. "I think you should watch." Something in his voice caused even the security officers to turn around. Across the lobby, Emily stood from her workstation. Her heart pounded. She already knew what was coming. She had seen the file. She had seen the photograph. The screen shifted. A narrator's voice filled the lobby. "Today marks a new chapter. For Meridian Hospitality Group." Guests stopped walking. Employees froze. The presentation continued. Images of hotels appeared one after another. Expansion plans, growth projections, new investments. Then the final slide arrived. A photograph filled every screen in the building. The lobby became completely silent. Richard's expression vanished. Not changed. Vanished. Because the face on every screen belonged to the man he had spent the last half hour trying to remove. "Please welcome Darius Bennett, principal investor and new owner of Meridian Hospitality Group." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Even the fountain seemed quieter. Darius stood slowly. Not dramatically. Not triumphantly. Simply stood. The same man. The same clothes. The same calm expression. Only now the room finally understood what it was seeing. Emily closed her eyes for a second. The security officers exchanged stunned looks. Guests stared from Darius to the screens and back again. Richard looked as though the floor had shifted beneath him. "No," he said quietly. Then louder. "No. There must be some mistake." Darius met his gaze. "That is interesting." Richard swallowed hard. "What is?" Darius folded his hands. "For 30 minutes you never once thought there might be a mistake when it involved me." The words landed harder than any raised voice ever could. The lobby remained frozen. Upstairs, applause erupted from the conference room as the live presentation continued. Downstairs, nobody was clapping. They were processing, replaying every assumption, every glance, every decision, every word. Richard opened his mouth again, searching for an explanation that no longer existed. Darius looked around the room before speaking one final sentence. "You were never evaluating who I was." His voice remained steady. "You were revealing who you are." And in that moment, the entire hotel understood that the real announcement was not happening upstairs. It was happening right there in the lobby. The silence lasted only a few seconds, but for Richard Coleman it felt much longer. Every face in the lobby had changed. Guests who had been watching with uncertainty now watched with understanding. Employees who had stayed quiet now understood exactly what they had witnessed. The story had reversed. The assumptions had not. Darius remained standing beside the seating area, calm as ever. He did not look victorious. He looked disappointed. That somehow made the moment heavier. Richard tried to recover. "Mr. Bennett, I think there has been a misunderstanding." The words sounded weak even to him. Darius did not respond immediately. He glanced around the lobby instead. At the security officers. At the guests. At Emily. Then back at Richard. "A misunderstanding requires missing information," he said quietly. "You had information. You simply chose which information mattered." Nobody interrupted. Nobody defended Richard. The lobby had become a courtroom without a judge. Then Richard's phone vibrated. He looked down automatically. An email notification appeared across the screen. His face drained of color. Another notification followed immediately. Then another. Department heads throughout the company were receiving the same message. Corporate transition notice. Mandatory leadership review. Immediate access audit. Richard stared at the screen. His hands suddenly felt unsteady. Across the front desk, supervisors checked their own devices. Confused whispers spread through the staff. Emily's computer refreshed. A company-wide bulletin appeared. Effective immediately, all management access credentials would undergo executive review as part of the ownership transition process. Additional notifications would follow. The timing could not have been worse for Richard. Or more precise, Darius's phone rang. He answered calmly. Sophia. A brief pause. Several people close enough to hear caught fragments of the conversation. Yes. Begin the review process. Include today. Another pause. Every report. Every complaint. Every employee statement. Richard swallowed hard. For the first time, he seemed to understand that this was no longer about one interaction in a lobby. It was about a culture, a pattern, a standard. The security officers stepped back on their own. Nobody instructed them to. The situation no longer required their presence. One of them even offered Darius a respectful nod. Darius returned it. Emily watched everything unfold. She remembered how easily she could have stayed silent. How easy it would have been to look away. Instead, she walked out from behind the desk. Richard noticed her approaching. Emily, he began. Not now, she said softly. It was not disrespectful. It was honest. She turned toward Darius. I should have spoken sooner. Darius smiled faintly. You spoke when it mattered. Emily felt a weight leave her shoulders. Around them, guests began returning to their conversations. Elevators opened and closed. Luggage rolled across marble floors. The hotel slowly started moving again. But it was not the same hotel. Something had shifted. Something important. Richard stood alone behind the front desk, staring at the notifications still arriving on his phone. The authority he had relied on all morning suddenly felt fragile. And as executives from upstairs began making their way toward the lobby following the announcement, one truth became impossible to ignore. The consequences had not started because Darius revealed his power. They had started because everyone finally saw how that power had been treated before it was revealed. Executives began flowing into the lobby from the conference level above. Their conversations stopped the moment they saw Darius standing near the center of the room. Several immediately walked toward him and offered handshakes. Others welcomed him as the new owner. The reaction alone erased any remaining doubt. Guests watched quietly. Employees stood still. The truth no longer needed an announcement. It was standing right in front of them. Darius greeted each executive politely before turning his attention back to the lobby itself. The same lobby where he had spent the last hour being questioned. The same lobby where assumptions had carried more weight than facts. Richard remained behind the front desk. He looked smaller now, not because anything physical had changed, because certainty had left him. The confidence that had filled every conversation earlier was gone. Darius walked toward the front desk. No anger, no celebration, no desire to embarrass anyone, just purpose. The room seemed to lean closer. When I first entered this hotel today, Darius said, I was looking for information. Nobody interrupted. Not financial information. Not occupancy numbers. Not performance reports. I already had those. I was looking for something more important. He paused. Character. The words settled over the lobby. Employees lowered their eyes. Others listened carefully. Buildings can be renovated. Systems can be upgraded. Marketing campaigns can be replaced. But culture determines everything. Darius looked around the room. Culture is revealed when people think nobody important is watching. Emily felt those words immediately. So did several employees standing nearby. Darius continued. This morning I saw employees who treated strangers with kindness. I saw people helping guests without being asked. I saw professionalism. I saw excellence. Then his expression hardened slightly. I also saw something else. Nobody needed clarification. Richard stared at the counter. The silence spoke for itself. Darius turned toward Emily. Miss Carter. She looked up. Thank you for choosing integrity when it would have been easier to stay silent. Emily blinked, surprised. I was just trying to do the right thing. Darius smiled. That is exactly the point. Several executives exchanged approving looks. They understood the message. Then Darius faced the entire lobby once more. Today is not about punishment. It is about standards. The room remained silent. Every guest who walks through these doors deserves respect before anyone knows their title, their income, or their position. Respect is not something people earn after they prove themselves. It is where professionalism begins. A few guests nodded. One elderly woman near the fireplace quietly applauded. Others followed. The applause spread naturally through the lobby. Not loud, not dramatic, genuine. Darius waited for it to fade before speaking one final time. His voice remained calm, steady, certain. I did not invest in this company to own hotels. He looked around the room. I invested in it to build places where dignity is never determined by appearance. Nobody spoke after that. They did not need to. The message had already landed. The lobby felt different now. Lighter, clearer, as if something invisible had finally been brought into the open. And while many people would remember the ownership announcement from that day, those who stood in the lobby would remember something else. They would remember the moment a quiet man walked through the front door, was judged before he was known, and still chose to raise the standard instead of his voice.